For years, my parents had told me about the crazy bus crash that happened near our house, years and years ago. One morning, just days before I was born, my mother had been out in the garden plucking weeds when she heard a horrible noise. It was a series of high-pitched screams, then a screeching of tires, followed by a tremendous crash. All the people in the area rushed out of their houses to see what was going on. Down at the bottom of the old coach road, they found black tire marks leading to a nearby cliff. When they rushed to the edge of the cliff, they saw the wreckage of a bus down below. It had apparently driven straight off the cliff and crashed on the jagged rocks at the bottom. The people ran down to where the smoking wreckage was laying strewn about in an effort to help the survivors. They were horrified when they discovered that it was the local school bus and all the passengers on board were their own children. The bodies of the dead kids lay tangled in the twisted metal. Some had been thrown out of the bus as it fell, and their bodies had smashed against the rocks, killing them on impact. Others had been decapitated by flying glass shards and shards of metal inside the bus. The parents were screaming and crying as they found the mangled remains of their sons and daughters in the charred wreckage. When the ambulance and fire department arrived, they found no survivors. Every single child on the bus had been killed in the crash. It was the most horrific disaster the area had ever experienced. In one horrible moment, an entire generation had been wiped out. The parents of the dead children were inconsolable. A few days later, a huge funeral was held for all the kids who had perished. People came from miles around to pay their respects and share in the grief. Almost every family in the area had lost a child in the accident. Some had even lost 2 or 3. Almost 40 small coffins were lowered into the ground that day. An inquest was held shortly afterwards, and the police got to the bottom of what happened and finally determined who was to blame for causing the terrible crash. It seems that a mental patient from the local asylum had escaped the night before, and he had broken into the bus station and stolen a driver's uniform. That night he lay in wait as the doors of the bus station were unlocked. Then he crept aboard the school bus and drove out through the gates without alerting anyone. That morning he drove the school bus around the countryside, picking up all the unsuspecting kids who were waiting by the roadside on their way to school. He was dressed in a bus driver's uniform, so nobody suspected a thing. Once he had collected every kid on the route, the mental patient floored the accelerator and drove at a high speed off the cliff. The people in our area never forgot the terrible accident that the escaped mental patient caused. When I was growing up, there were not many other kids to play with, because most of them had been killed in that crazy bus crash. The only kids that survived were those who had been too young to attend school at the time. So the story I'm about to tell happened when I was 13 years old. My parents allowed me to go to the movies in a theater in town. I met a bunch of friends there and we had a great time watching the movie. Afterwards, we lost track of time and it was very late by the time we decided to go home. I must have been waiting at the bus stop for half an hour before I realized that I had missed the last bus. Cursing myself for being so careless, I wondered, how would I manage to get home? It wasn't all that far to walk, perhaps a mile or 2, but the roads were very treacherous at night because in our area there were no street lamps to light the way. A lot of people had been hit by cars as they walked in the darkness. So I wandered around and I found a payphone and called home. My mom answered and I told her I'd missed the last bus home. She began to panic, telling me that my father was out and he had taken the car with him. She wouldn't be able to pick me up. I told her I'd just walk home, but she begged me not to, saying that the roads were much too dangerous at that time of night. Even worse, it was beginning to snow, which meant that even if a car did manage to see me in the dark, It probably wouldn't have time to brake before it hit me. She said she would try to contact our neighbors and see if they would be able to drive into town and pick me up. After I hung up the phone, I began to get impatient. Eventually, I decided that the only thing I could do was walk home by myself, so I set off and hoped for the best. I was walking along the lonely country road in complete darkness, trying not to trip over a pothole or fall into a ditch, when I saw headlights coming up over the hill behind me. Whether it was a car or a bus, it was coming up very fast and quite noiselessly through the snow-covered road. As it drew nearer, I could make out the outlines of the vehicle. It appeared to be a bus, and my only hope was the driver would be able to see me in the dark and stop for me. It came around the bend of the road and bathed me in bright white light. The headlights blazed through the darkness like a pair of fiery dragon's breath. I jumped to the side of the road and waved my hand, but the bus passed me at full speed, and for a moment I feared that he had missed it. But then I heard the screech of the brakes and the bus stopped dead a short distance ahead of me. I ran as fast as I could and came up just as the door swung open. As soon as I stepped in, the door shut behind me and the driver took off again at full speed. The bus was dark inside, but as my eyes began to adjust, I could see that it was almost full, despite the fact that I was late at night. I found a vacant seat and sat down, resting my weary legs. The atmosphere of the coach seemed cold, colder if possible than outside, and there was a strange and disagreeable smell. I looked around at the other passengers. They were all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each of them stared straight ahead. The deathly quiet was unsettling, and the smell was quickly becoming unbearable. I felt much too ill to say anything at all. The icy coldness inside the bus chilled me to the bone, and the strange smell was making me sick. Shivering from head to foot, I turned to the boy beside me and asked if I could open a window. He didn't answer me. He didn't even blink. I repeated the question more loudly, but still got no answer. When I could go no longer and couldn't stand that stench, I reached across and tried to open the window myself, but the latch broke off in my hand. It was then that I realized the window was covered in cobwebs and mildew. In fact, every part of the bus seemed to be in a terrible state of disrepair, almost decay. The leather seats were crusted with mold, and the floor was literally rotting and breaking away beneath my feet. I turned to the boy beside me again and asked, "What is wrong with this bus?" Without saying a word, he turned his face slowly and looked at me in the face. I will never forget that look as long as I live. My heart turned cold and all the blood drained from my face. His eyes were wide and seemed as if they were popping out of his head. His face was as pale and leathery as a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back, showing big yellow teeth. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a dreadful feeling of horror came over me. I became aware that everyone on the bus was staring straight at me with the same ghastly look on their faces. Their awful faces were covered in rotting flesh, and their clothes were covered in dirt. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all staring menacingly at me. A shriek of terror burst from my lips as I ran down the aisle, threw myself against the door, and tried to open it. In that single instant, the bus door swung open. I heard a mighty crash as the bus rocked to and fro like a ship in the storm at sea. Then I heard many voices, children's voices, all screaming in unison, and I felt a crushing pain before everything went black. It seemed as if I'd been unconscious for days when I woke up and found my mother by my bedside. She told me I had fallen over a cliff near the old coach road. The only reason I hadn't been killed was that I had landed on a deep snowdrift that accumulated on the rocks beneath. I was discovered at daybreak by a local farmer who carried me to the nearest hospital. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with 2 broken legs, a broken arm, and a deep cut in my forehead. The place where I fell, my mom told me, was the exact spot where the horrible school bus accident had happened 13 years before. Now, you can believe what you want. Some people may call me a liar and others may say I'm just crazy. But now I know that 13 years ago, days before I was born, I was a passenger in that crazy bus crash. This is the story of a dream. You know, the kind of dream where you suddenly become aware that you're dreaming? That was the kind of dream this was. I was all alone standing on the platform of a deserted, dimly lit railway station. Wow, what a boring dream, I thought to myself. Just then I heard an announcement come over the loudspeaker. A dull, monotone voice was saying, "The train will be arriving shortly. If you get on board, you will experience something very scary." Soon after this cryptic announcement, the train pulled into the station. However, it wasn't really a train. It looked more like the kind of train you see at amusement parks, like a roller coaster or the monkey train they had at the zoo. There were a few men and women sitting in the cars, and their faces were very pale. What a weird dream, I thought, but I was curious about the announcement I had heard. Would I really see something scary? What would it be? I decided to get on the train and find out. After all, how scary could it be if it was just something I was dreaming? I sat down in the third car from the back. The air around me felt uncomfortably warm. Everything seemed so realistic that I began to wonder if I was actually dreaming. "The train is now departing," said the announcement. As the train began to move, my heart was pounding with anticipation and anxiety. I wondered what was going to happen. Soon after the train left the platform, we entered a tunnel that was illuminated by an eerie purple light. "I've seen this tunnel before," I said to myself. It was the tunnel from a ghost train ride at an amusement park I used to visit as a kid. That's why I was dreaming about this weird monkey train. I was just remembering all the haunted house rides from my childhood. This really isn't anything to be scared of, I told myself. Just then, there was another announcement. "Next stop, Aikizukuri. Aikizukuri is next." Aikizukuri, I thought. That's not a station, it's a rare Japanese dish. A skillful Japanese chef can cut up a fish and cook it in such a way that it's still alive when they serve it to you. The poor fish lies on your plate, gasping for air while you eat it. It's grotesque, but in Japan it's considered a delicacy. I was still thinking about it when I heard a loud, piercing scream coming from behind me. I turned around and saw 4 hunchback midgets dressed in rags. They were surrounding the man in the last seat. As I looked closer, I saw that they were wearing monkey masks and brandishing large, sharp knives. Right before my eyes, they began cutting the man into pieces. They were preparing him just like a chef prepares aikizukuri. An overpowering stench filled the air, and the man kept screaming and screaming as they pulled his bloody organs out of his body and scattered them all around the train car. I noticed a sickly-looking woman with long hair sitting directly behind me. When the screaming started, she began to panic, but only for a moment. Then, she just became silent and faced the front, as if nothing was going on. I was terrified by the horrible things that were happening behind me, and I started to wonder whether or not I was really just dreaming. When I turned around again, the man in the back seat was gone. All that remained were bloodstains and chunks of red meat. The woman behind me was still staring straight ahead, her face expressionless. "Next stop, Scooping," the announcement said. Scooping is next. This time, 2 of the monkey-faced guys appeared, carrying spoons with serrated edges. They began to scoop out the eyes of the woman behind me. Up until now, she had been expressionless, but the pain twisted her face in a look of horror. She began shrieking so loudly that I thought my eardrums would burst. Her eyeballs flew out of their sockets. The stench of blood and sweat was unbearable. I was bent over, shivering in fear. This was my cue to leave. I couldn't take any more of this. Wake up, I told myself. I have to get out of here. Please, please wake up. Then a horrible thought struck me. Judging how things had been going, I was next in line. Next stop, minced meat, came the announcement. Minced meat is next. I felt sick. It wasn't hard to imagine what was going to happen next. I concentrated as hard as I could, trying desperately to force myself to wake up from this dream. Come on, wake up, I told myself. It's just a dream. Wake up. Come on, wake up. Suddenly, I heard a loud, metallic whirling noise. It sounded like a grinding machine. This time, the 2 guys were sitting on my knees. They were holding a strange-looking contraption that I assumed was a mincing machine. I was terrified. It's all a horrible dream. Wake up. Wake up. I closed my eyes and prayed as hard as I could. For the love of God, please wake up. The sound was getting closer and closer. I could feel the wind from the machine on my face. I was sure there was no hope for me. It was over. I was a goner for sure. Then, all of a sudden, everything went silent. I woke up in bed, soaked with sweat. Tears were streaming down my face. Somehow, I had managed to escape from the nightmare. I scrambled out of bed and went into the kitchen, where I got a drink of water and tried to calm myself down. That was horribly realistic, I thought to myself. Thank God it was only a dream. The next day at school, I told all my friends about the terrible dream I had experienced. I expected them to be horrified, but they all just thought it was funny. I guess it was, in a way. After all, it was just a dream. 4 years passed and I finished college, and I had completely forgot about the dream. That's when it happened. One night when I was working late at the office, it had been a busy day and I was very tired. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment. Then I heard, "Next stop, scooping. Scooping is next." It was the same. Everything came flooding back. The same 2 crooked midgets in monkey masks were gouging out the eyes of the same girl. It's just a dream. Wake up. Wake up. I started praying, but I couldn't wake up. It's just a damn dream. Wake up. Next stop, minced meat. Minced meat is next. No, this is too much. The machine, it was getting closer. It's just a dream. Wake up. Come on, please, wake up. Suddenly, there was once again silence. I had escaped again, or so I thought. Just as I was about to open my eyes, I heard a voice say, "Are you running away again? The next time we come for you will be the last." I opened my eyes, and this time I was really awake and in my room. But the announcement I had heard definitely wasn't in the dream. I had heard it here, in the real world. I know that I did. There's no mistake about it. Why me? What have I done to deserve this? I haven't had the dream since then, but I know the next time I have that dream, I'll probably die. It will probably be from a heart attack or something else like that. In this world, it might seem like a heart attack, but in the other world, I know I'll be minced meat. When I was in high school, there was one boy in my class who was very, very strange looking. Most of the other kids were afraid of him, and everybody kept out of his way. He always kept to himself and never spoke to anyone. His name was Craig, but we gave him the nickname Crazy Eyes. He had the strangest eyes you had ever seen. They were large, round, bugged out, and disturbing. They didn't look human. It was as if they belonged to some sort of exotic reptile, like a chameleon or a lizard. During class, he remained completely silent, never asking or answering any questions. I got the impression that the teachers were scared of him as well. All he did was stare at everyone with his huge bugged out eyes, creeping them all out with that unsettling gaze of his. One Monday morning we had a media class. The teacher split us up into groups and gave us the task of making a short film. Due to the luck of the draw, Craig was assigned to our group. While we gathered around and discussed ideas, he kept his mouth tightly shut and just stared at us all with his big, bulbous eyes. We eventually came up with an idea for a slasher movie. The plot involved a crazed killer who goes around the school stabbing people. Craig was so odd-looking that we unanimously decided that he should play the killer. His crazy eyes made him the obvious choice. As it turned out, the movie was a great big success. We managed to create a 5-minute film that looked almost as professional as a Hollywood horror flick. Surprisingly, Craig did a great job in his role as the killer. We shot hours of footage of him stalking the school grounds, running from tree to tree. He was armed with a fake knife that had a retractable blade. Then we filmed him stabbing a bunch of kids who were playing the victims. They were soaked from head to toe with fake blood. Taking part in the movie, Craig really seemed to come out of his shell. He took to acting like fish to water. When filming was complete, we all noticed a big change in his personality. Somehow it boosted his confidence, and although he still didn't talk very much, he held his head up high and seemed more sure of himself. On Friday, when we screened the film for the entire class, they loved it and started chanting, "Craig, Craig, Craig." That day, he was the most popular kid in the class and seemed to revel in the attention. However, when Monday morning arrived, Crazy Eyes Craig was nowhere to be seen. He didn't show up for school and nobody seemed to know where he was. For the rest of the week, he was absent from school. That weekend, I was at home working on an assignment for school. I overheard a report on the news about an attempted murder that had happened in our town. Shocked, I glanced up from my work, and when I set eyes on the picture they were showing on the TV screen, a chill ran down my spine. It was Craig. His humongous, crazy eyes stared at me from the TV screen as the news reporter continued with the story. Apparently, he had been stalking his next-door neighbor. She was a 16-year-old girl named Leanne. She, her younger sister, and her mother had been home alone while her father was away on business. The two girls stayed up late watching a horror movie on TV. It was A Nightmare on Elm Street. During the movie, they started to notice something strange. They opened up a box of cereal and took 2 bowls into the living room to eat, but when Leanne went back to the kitchen, she found that the box was empty. When the movie finished, the girls went upstairs to get ready for bed. Leanne opened her bedroom closet and found Craig standing there, holding a hatchet. He was dressed in her mother's clothes and had makeup smeared all over his face. He told her to be quiet and tied her up. Then he fetched her mother and her sister and marched them to the back room. He tied up them as well and left all three laying on the floor. He told them that he was going to kill them and that he'd be right back, so they better start praying. The police said he went downstairs to ransack the house and steal valuables. While he was gone, the youngest girl managed to wiggle free of her bonds. She jumped out the window and ran to a nearby house to raise the alarm. Within minutes, the police were breaking down the front door. They ran up the stairs with their guns drawn and found Leanne and her mother lying hogtied on the bedroom floor, but there was no sign of Crazy Eyes Craig. The police freed the mother and daughter before conducting a search of the entire house. They combed the place from top to bottom, but couldn't find any traces of Craig. It was as if he had vanished into the night. In fact, nobody had any idea where Craig was, and while he was still at large, no one in the town could rest easy. The incident was a huge shock for our small town. Before that, it had been a peaceful, idyllic little place. Nobody ever locked their doors. That night, I watched my father screwing 2 sturdy deadbolts onto our front and back doors. On Monday morning, it was the talk of the school. None of the kids could believe what had happened, and everyone was terrified. At the back of the school building, there was a huge forest, and rumors spread among the kids that Craig was hiding out in the woods, laying in wait for more victims. Some kids were even too scared to show up for class. Leanne and her family stayed with relatives for a few days to get away from the house. In all that time, law enforcement combed the woods and searched house to house, but nobody could find the crazy-eyed maniac. Eventually, Leanne and her family had to go home. As soon as they pulled into their driveway, they saw something that terrified them. Craig was standing at the top of an upstairs window, gazing out at them with a smirk on his face. The girl's father started yelling. The neighbors came running over. The police were called, and within minutes they were surrounding the house. A SWAT team were readying themselves beside a van, loading their weapons and studying the layout of the house. They searched the house from top to bottom, but they didn't find Craig anywhere. Instead, they were confronted by a disturbing scene. Pennies were glued to the ceiling, and there was strange writing all over the walls. All of their clothes had been cut into ribbons, and the entire contents of the kitchen fridge was neatly arranged on the living room floor, and the whole place reeked of urine and feces. The police conducted another thorough search of the house, but it turned up nothing. Just when they were about to give up and go home, one of the cops mentioned that he thought he heard a faint noise when he was in the basement. Sounded like it was coming from behind the washing machine. The SWAT team immediately recognized and descended cautiously into the basement. With their guns drawn, they pulled the washing machine away from the wall, and curled up in a hole behind it, they found Craig. As it turned out, the truth was much more disturbing than anyone had imagined. Leanne and her family were horrified. For 2 whole years, Craig had been living in their walls. They found peepholes everywhere. While Leanne and her family had been sitting at home, watching TV, eating dinner, taking showers, getting dressed, going to the washroom, and sleeping peacefully in their beds, Craig had been there the entire time, silently watching them with his crazy, bugged-out eyes. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you'd like to, you can follow me at Twitter. The handle is @FuzzyPantaloons, and I'll see you all next